Hello, I'm Graham McTavish, and I've come here to rural Warwickshire in the heart of England to explore the background to one of the most famous works of literature in the world, The Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien's great work has its roots firmly set in this landscape. The main legacy from Tolkien's time as a young boy here in rural Warwickshire was his immense fondness and respect for the ordinary rural population among whom he spent his formative years. Together, this gentle English landscape, with its quiet villages and respectable, orderly population, produced the inspiration for the Shire from which the whole great adventure begins.
Really, he's not like any other figure in English literature, very, very isolated in every sense. He was isolated socially. He moved in a small circle of Oxford dons, but not outside at all. He, I think, read very, very little in modern English writing. Not that much in English literature. In fact, since Chaucer, he used to say, English literature stopped at Chaucer. The main point about his Oxford career was that it gave him a lovely, cosy nest, really, to inhabit. His teaching duties weren't that heavy. He had a big house in North Oxford in which his 4 children grew up. He had marvellous friends in C.S. Lewis and other dons of like mind, all of them strongly religious, all of them liking fairy stories and myths, and they would meet together in Oxford pubs for pints of beer, and in Lewis's rooms in college on Thursday nights, and drink their beer and smoke their pipes and talk good manly talk and read their stories to each other. That was really wonderful. That's what was the best part of his life and really gave him the encouragement to go on writing.
The Return of the King brings to a close a long, complex narrative. Its complexity was, in many ways, something Tolkien himself never intended. He'd set out simply to write another Hobbit. But as he says in his introduction, this tale grew in the telling. Tracing the movements of the characters in The Return of the King is an intricate business. The increasingly scattered members of the Fellowship of the Ring follow very different paths. And The Return of the King opens with Gandalf's and Pippin's arrival at the wonderful city of Minas Tirith, the chief city of Gondor. Minas Tirith occupies the easternmost shoulders of the White Mountains, facing Mordor across the river plain of the Anduin. It climbs the slopes in 7 concentric terraces, each with its own rampart pierced by a single gate. Each gate occurs at a different part of the wall's circumference, so that a journey from the first level to the 7th would follow a zigzag path up the slope. A great pier of natural stone cuts the city into 2 down its center, higher than the walls themselves and jutting from the side of the mountains like a ship's prow.
It's as if he could see clearly in his mind's eye what he was describing, which is completely imaginary, but he could see every detail of it. And that enables the reader to have this very strong sense of place. I think that must be one of the main reasons why Tolkien's readers often feel as if they've been to these places.
Tolkien contributed to this cliche a little bit by talking in letters and in conversations himself about feeling that he'd been exploring, that this was a land that he hadn't created lock, stock, and barrel all in one go, but that he got rolling and that he entered into himself in his imagination and began to explore. And so the world unfolds for the reader of the book very much as it did for Tolkien himself in the progress of writing it.
He was creating a history, a myth, a mythology for England, he called it. And that involved not just a story, it involved geography, cartography, geology, ethnography, any other ography you like. He had to do it all, and he did.
He used to draw enormous charts and maps of not just the landscape, but also things like the phases of the moon, the weather, perhaps even the tides, things that he was certain he had got to get right because he was writing a real story about a real world, so it seemed to him. And everything must work on its own terms, must fit, or the thing wasn't going to be real to him.
Gandalf and Pippin proceed immediately to an audience with Denethor, the reigning steward. Denethor is also the father of Faramir and the slain Boromir. Aged, careworn and stern, Denethor sees little hope for the survival of Minas Tirith and Gondor. He has a scathing disregard for Gandalf's plan to destroy the ring, which he views as hopeless folly.
As a professor of Anglo-Saxon literature, Tolkien was immersed in the surviving literature from the Dark Ages. And one of the overriding qualities of what survives is that sense of melancholy that pervades the remaining fragments often. The whole genre conveys a sense of sadness, loss, decline, even decay. It's almost the essential ingredient. And in Beowulf, for example, we see this in the atmosphere of Hrothgar's Hall, which is haunted by the monster Grendel. It's a gloomy and miserable portrait, and there are very strong echoes of that, most obviously in the rather bleak picture of Theoden's Hall, which we saw in the Two Towers.
Denethor interrogates Pippin closely about Boromir's death. Pippin tells him what he can, and in an unplanned gesture, offers Denethor his service in gratitude for Boromir's struggle to save his and Mary's lives. Denethor accepts his offer, ordering him to join his household. The narrative then leaves Pippin and turns to Merry, who was left behind with Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli among the riders of Rohan. After Gandalf and Pippin's departure, Aragorn uses the Palantir of Orthanc, gazing into it to challenge Sauron.
The way each Palantir affected the person using it seems to have a close relationship to the legitimacy of its use by that person. Does this person have the right to use this Palantir, as it were? So Aragorn's right, as he said, couldn't be doubted. With Denethor, although he had a very, very strong personality, he didn't have an incontestable right to use that Palantir. He was using it, as it were, illicitly. And that's why I think Sauron was able to influence his mind and ultimately unhinge his mind, not by lying to Denethor, but by showing him selectively what was the case. Sauron was being economical with the truth with Denethor.
Through the Palantir, he discerns a new threat to Gondor. An unforeseen force of corsairs from the havens of Umbar, far to the south, have allied themselves with Sauron and are planning to sail up the mouths of the Anduin to join the attack on Minas Tirith. Their intervention spells the city's certain defeat, for the forces of Rohan need 10 days to muster and ride to the city's aid. Aragorn therefore resolves to follow a different road to Minas Tirith, one that leads through the paths of the dead. His intention fills the men of Rohan with dismay, who can foresee only Aragorn throwing his life away on a fruitless errand. Nevertheless, he parts courteously with Theoden, leaving Merry with the riders to serve the king, with whom he has formed an affectionate friendship.
Throughout the trilogy, the hobbits represent the qualities in the ordinary English rural population which Tolkien admired. Remember, he'd served alongside them in the trenches of the Great War, and he'd seen it firsthand just how resolute ordinary Englishmen can be under extreme circumstances, and he'd grown to respect them very much. And of course, in both world wars, they'd come through against enormous adversity to prove themselves to be winners. So it's no surprise that the officer class, if you like to put it that way, in the form of Theoden and Denethor, quickly recognised the qualities of dignity and courage which Tolkien has embodied in the hobbits. And despite the overwhelming forces ranged against them, they're not daunted, and they bring a glimmer of hope in the darkness. And these are the signals which are read by Denethor and Theoden.
With Legolas, Gimli and a party of rangers sent by Elrond from the north, Aragorn rides out to seek the entrance to the underground tunnel which enters the White Mountains at Dunharrow in the north, emerging through a narrow defile on the mountain's southern slopes above Erech. The company enters the subterranean way and find themselves followed by an invisible host of spirits who offer them no challenge, but terrify them with a palpable sense of malice. Aragorn summons them as Isildur's heir to a trysting place on the other side of the White Mountains, where they can fulfill their ancient vow and find peace.
The culmination of the ride through the Pass of the Dead is that Aragorn's claim to the kingship simply cannot be doubted because it's recognized by the dead. And if anybody should know the heir of Isildur, they should.
In the meantime, Merry, now left alone among the riders, is dismayed to learn that Theoden means to leave him behind with his niece Eowyn, the sister of Eomer, whom he has appointed to govern the Rohirrim in his absence.
In many ways, Tolkien used the hobbits to introduce the modern reader, the contemporary reader, into this ancient world. And since the contemporary reader is not likely to feel himself or herself to be a strapping, valiant warrior, but in fact have more, as it were, spiritual affinity with a rather small, vulnerable person who's fond of his or her home comforts. The hobbits make a very good sort of point of entry into this world. So I think it's a good choice that you have this small kind of person doing the best they can in these circumstances. If everybody was like Aragorn and Theoden, I don't think it would work.
Eowyn, who has fallen in love with Aragorn from a distance, has fallen into a bleak despair at his departure. But in the guise of a young rider named Dernhelm, she offers to take Merry secretly with the host as they ride to the aid of Minas Tirith.
She is in this situation, which is again very familiar from the Norse sagas. We are men and we will go off and do the fighting, but when the men are all slain and the house is burnt down, you have leave to be burnt with it. And, you know, which is what happens in a lot of these old Norse sagas. And she doesn't want to do that, and but she's also got this desperate love for Aragorn, and so she goes off to seek death as a warrior.
Tolkien is often accused of marginalising the women in his work, sometimes to the point of misogyny. But although there are comparatively few of them, they're all strong characters, and they represent as much a force for the good as the men do. If you look at Arwen, Galadriel and Eowyn, they all have to make very tough choices, and they prove themselves, each in different ways, to be selfless, courageous, and as such they're essential to the plot, and they're not just an adjunct to it.
That night, a great cloud covers the sky, a canopy of fumes from Mount Doom that blackens the night and turns the day into a dispiriting grey twilight. Concealed behind Dernhelm, Merry witnesses the muster of Rohan as the riders set out for Minas Tirith. The narrative now returns to the siege of Minas Tirith. Denethor reveals his bitter resentment of Faramir's regard for Gandalf, lamenting the lost Boromir as his true son. The following day, he orders Faramir to take charge of the city's last line of defense at the western banks of the Great River, against the advice of many who feel their forces are already too thinly stretched. News comes shortly after that the effort proved a costly waste. The armies of Mordor forced the crossing, with heavy losses on both sides, and were pursuing the survivors across the plains, back to Minas Tirith.
In the third book, The Return of the King, you have a new way of looking at the forces of Mordor, the power of Mordor, in that it's not qualitatively different, but it's sort of quantitatively different. I think that's the point in the whole story, where you come to realize just how immeasurably powerful and strong Mordor is in physical and military terms. And at that point, it's difficult not to have a sneaking sympathy with Denethor, because that's the sort of thing he was being shown. Endless forces, battlement upon battlement, and how could this ever be defeated?
Faramir has been grievously wounded, and Denethor attends him. Smitten with remorse for his hard words, he no longer cares about the defense of his city, which he now openly admits to be hopeless.
Well, Tolkien avoided allegory, as we know, but I think he was trying to get something across through the character of Denethor. And what he was concerned with was the sin of despair. And Gandalf makes the point against Denethor, which is, I think, terribly important. Gandalf says something like, despair is only for those who know the end beyond any doubt, and we don't. Denethor decided that he did know the end beyond any doubt, which was a mistake.
He comes very quickly into conflict with Gandalf once he arrives on the scene at Minas Tirith, and it's in the contrast between their characters that we see sort of the failings in Denethor, I think as Tolkien wanted us to see them, that in his stern devotion to duty, in his sense that his mission as steward of Gondor and the fate of Gondor as the nation in his care was all that mattered, he'd become too narrow. He'd become too fixated. And in that narrowness, he became vulnerable then when that mission became threatened by the supremacy of Mordor in military terms. He became prey to despair, which in the end he succumbs to.
The armies of Mordor arrive before the city, and it is now that Gandalf takes command.
The siege of Minas Tirith is mainly an opportunity for Tolkien to really get stuck into a kind of writing that he's actually very, very good at, which is battle scenes.
In that siege, he narrates the action itself with incredible economy, and this is where I think he's being quite modern. It moves at a very brisk clip, as good as you could get in any action film, a lot of readers reckon, I think. But at the same time, every detail of that action is there to highlight some aspect of the character who's center stage at that moment. You encounter many confrontations during the siege, and they're not all between the opposed forces that are actually doing the fighting. You spend much more time observing confrontations, for example, between Gandalf and Denethor, or between Faramir and Denethor. And you view them through the eyes of Pippin, who has a different relationship with each of those three characters, so that the very careful triangulation of characters in those scenes is very, very specific, and Tolkien knew exactly what he was doing there, and he was getting it almost directly from poems like Beowulf that he knew so well.
Really, the gist of it is the sheer verve of the writing. It carries you along. It's extremely powerful and vivid, and you can't not turn the page.
Very soon, the tide of battle turns against the defenders. As the fighting rages, Denethor orders the guard to take Faramir to the tombs of the kings and stewards of Gondor. There he has him laid on a pyre and prepares to immolate both Faramir and himself.
This really is a masterful piece of writing. It's a wonderful juxtaposition of the frantic physical actions at the walls, which is so fast-paced and realistic. It really moves along at a breathtaking pace. And it's action on a huge scale. But the action is contrasted with the intense psychological drama which is being played out on an intimate scale in the Citadel. It all adds to the sense of overwhelming danger and intolerable pressure from every side which is being brought to bear on the city. And as the disasters pile up one on the other, it really has the effect of placing the reader into the rather uncomfortable shoes of the defenders.
Horrified at Denethor's intentions, Pippin leaves Beregond to defend Faramir and dashes off to find Gandalf. The wizard, however, has other things on his mind. Pippin finds Gandalf at the main gates, just as they are smashed in by a great battering ram, and the Lord of the Nazgul rides in. As they confront each other, the Nazgul mocks the ruin of Gandalf's hopes. But just then, a cock crows, and on the morning wind can be heard the battle horns of the newly arrived riders of Rohan. Relief has come to the city. The narrative now jumps back to the riders as they struggle against time to reach Minas Tirith. We now learn how they find unexpected help in the forest of Druadan. The forest is inhabited by a furtive race of Aboriginal men, whose leader, Gan Buri Gan, offers to show Theoden a shortcut that will bring the riders to Minas Tirith quickly and secretly by a shorter route through the Stonewain Valley to emerge just north of the outwalls of the Pelennor Fields outside Minas Tirith. The furtive wild men of the woods, or wozers as the Rohirrim call them, are the only new race which Tolkien introduces in The Return of the King. The word wozers emphasizes their undeveloped condition and is a modernized version of an Old English word meaning wild men. They are thus primitive in the eyes of the Rohirrim, being wood-dwelling hunter-gatherers with an intuitive relationship to the natural world and few visible accoutrements of civilization.
The glimpses we occasionally get into the layers of history which Tolkien has so carefully built up are one of the many things which make Middle-earth such a believable place. And the fact that there are races which have disappeared into the mists of time adds to the atmosphere of the work.
As the riders emerge onto the plains before Minas Tirith and draw up their battle formations, a sea wind begins to drive back the fumes of Mordor, and the light of morning falls upon the fields of Pelennor. The riders strike deep into the rear of the Mordor armies assembled before the walls of Minas Tirith. But there is still much to do. Theoden is in the thick of the fight, but he is suddenly overshadowed by the winged steed of the Lord of the Ringwraiths. Theoden's horse shies and throws him. Merry also finds himself thrown down, alone among the slain. Eowyn alone confronts the Lord of the Ringwraiths. She is driven to the ground by a blow from the Ringwraith's mace. But Merry, crawling unnoticed behind him, aims a stroke at the back of the Ringwraith's leg with the barrow blade. With a great cry, he dies, leaving Merry to wander the battlefield, his sword-arm numb, his vision fading.
With Eowyn, in the Return of the King, going so strongly into military mode, first of all, it's fairly plain that she does that because she is broken-hearted about Aragorn, and more to the point, ashamed of her people's, particularly her father's, weakness in the past. She identifies with their sort of great military glory of the past and wants to live in that way and redeem it. And it's magnificent what she does, and with Merry's help destroys the chief of the Nazgul. It's an extraordinary thing to do, but nonetheless, after all said and done, there is a sense that, well, maybe this isn't exactly what she's supposed to be doing with her life.
Meanwhile, the battle rages on. Suddenly ships appear on the river Anduin. The men of Gondor waver. They assume the corsairs of Umbar are attacking. But from the ships come Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli, leading the Rangers and other forces from the south. The new reinforcements finally succeed in tipping the balance and driving the armies of Mordor from the field.
It's a complicated battle, and it's not just the arrival of Rohan, which is a key moment, obviously, but the arrival of the boats as well, and then the new forces up from the south of Gondor that Aragorn has brought in his train. And I think all this adds to the feeling that Tolkien wanted to convey of just what a narrow shave it was, what a narrow escape the West has had in this siege. If just one of these complicated set of events that were necessary to save Minas Tirith had gone wrong, it would have fallen. Hence Aragorn's strategy that he presents to the captains of the West. We mustn't just sit here and wait for the next one. We can't win this militarily, so we must actually go out and meet the enemy. And that will be such a bizarre thing to do from his point of view that it can only lead him, that is Sauron, to suspect that we have the ring, because otherwise how would we have the nerve to do this, knowing what we know? It's a very intelligent strategy, actually, but in another sense, it's the only thing they could have done.
Gandalf, in the meantime, had been delayed by Denethor's despairing attempt to commit suicide, taking his ailing son Faramir with him. When Gandalf and Pippin reach the tombs, they find evidence of men fighting. Passing inside, they find Beregond defending Faramir, who lies feverish on the piled-up wood, while Denethor orders his men to slay Beregond and light the pyre. Gandalf halts the fighting and lifts Faramir free, but Denethor, driven mad in his despair, seizes a torch from an attendant and leaps onto the pyre, lighting it and lying down, a palantir clasped in his hands.
It wasn't just a question of him personally being doomed, or even just Minas Tirith. It was everything that Númenor and the men of Westerness represented. This noble attempt, as it were, to establish, let's say, a just kingdom in Middle-earth, that, as he saw it, had all failed.
In the end, his choice to fling himself onto his own funeral pyre, taking his failing son Faramir with him, in a way, it's its own gesture of defiance, given his special information, his inside information through the Palantir, that as he sees it, there is no hope for Gondor, that Sauron is coming, and he will come to gloat over his old opponents, and Denethor, in his pride, is not going to give him that satisfaction. Suicide, in a very limited sense, makes sense in that context for Denethor. Now, that said, tragically, he doesn't know the whole story. He lacks faith in Gandalf's plan for sending the hobbits with the ring. He's aware of it. He thinks it a piece of monumental folly which has doomed them, and he can't bring himself to trust in possibility.
And Denethor quitting in that manner was exactly what Tolkien was, as it were, warning us against.
Faramir, Eowyn and Merry are all taken to the Houses of Healing, where they are tended by Aragorn, who, as heir of Isildur, has inherited a gift of healing. He uses great skill to bring his charges back from the brink of death. Aragorn's character is finally fully revealed in The Return of the King. As his identity as the returned king emerges, so does the inherent nobility and generosity of spirit that especially qualifies him for his role. The masterful will that enables him to challenge Sauron through the Palantir, to lead his company through the paths of the dead, and to compel the old spirits to honor their ancient oath, is balanced by the tact, humor, and kindness he shows towards the hobbits and the convalescent Faramir and Eowyn in the Houses of Healing. The captains of the victorious Allied forces hold a council to ponder their next action. Gandalf advises that they march at once on Mordor, not with any hope of military victory, but as a diversion to keep Sauron's attention directed away from the quest of the Ring-Bearer.
The whole point of the strategy militarily is to keep Sauron engaged in order to give Frodo a chance to destroy the ring. That's the only hope, and that's what it's all about. There is no illusion of being able to defeat Sauron in his own terms, at his own game, which is sheer strength. That's not even an option.
Led by Gandalf and Aragorn, a force far too small for a serious assault on Mordor sets out, passing through Ithilien and thence to the battle plain before the Black Gate, sounding the challenge of the King of Gondor as they go.
With the trip of the captains of the West to the Black Gate, since Aragorn had recognized and had convinced all the others that purely military victory is not a possibility, if that's your starting point, then you really don't need to even take everybody along with you. You don't need to have as massive an army as you can. because it isn't going to be enough no matter how massive it is. So this again goes back to convincing Sauron that the only possible explanation for doing something so self-evidently stupid or suicidal is that you must have the ring with you.
In terms of Gandalf's own strategy for bringing about the destruction of the ring, it makes perfect sense as well. There's no way that with the forces they have they can seriously contemplate assaulting Mordor. There's every reason, every practical reason for trying to keep Sauron's attention away from his own domain where Frodo and Sam are crawling towards Mount Doom.
At the gate, they are met by a herald of Sauron, who mocks them and produces items once carried by Frodo and Sam, announcing that these spies' mission had failed. Gandalf defies him, and from the gates of Mordor a fresh army issues, quickly surrounding the small army of Gondor and its allies. Battle is joined. Pippin, taking his stand among the tower guard alongside Baragon, slays a troll before being knocked unconscious. With the overwhelming force brought to bear against them, it soon appears as if all will be lost.
In the Return of the King, you've got this double structure. You've got, first of all, the great heroic thing, the great battle and killing of the Nazgul and the shaping up for the great battle with the Dark Lord and all the heroic stuff again. Then back to Frodo and Sam, really getting closer and closer towards the end of their tether as they make their way through the really horrible situation of Mordor to Mount Doom, to the end of their quest, and realizing more and more that they're not going to get away.
Sam, in the aftermath of his fight with Shelob, is trying to find a way into the tower of Cirith Ungol to rescue Frodo. Climbing through the stories of the tower, Sam searches for Frodo, finding him at last at the very top, being menaced by the last surviving orcs. One of them tries to flee and falls, breaking his neck. The other races past Sam and escapes. Sam returns the ring to Frodo and finds orc clothes to disguise themselves in, and the hobbits set out on the last leg of their journey to Mount Doom.
How long you actually carried the ring and why you carried it were very important considerations in terms of how the ring affected you. And Frodo had carried the ring for much, much longer than Sam. So Sam's stint with the ring, his experience of the ring was very brief, and he only took it on very, very reluctantly when he thought Frodo was dead. He's not nearly so consumed by the ring as Frodo is.
From the high pass of Cirith Ungol, Frodo and Sam descend onto the plateau of Gorgoroth, the barren, ashy inner plain of Mordor. They journey northwards along the inner slopes of the Mountains of Shadow, turning east towards Mount Doom only when they have drawn level with it. Crawling furtively across the parched, ashen landscape, they are pursued by trackers and, taken for orcs by a passing troop, are compelled on a forced march. But they escape in the confusion when their troop collides with another at an intersection. Forcing themselves to the utmost reach of their endurance, they press on towards the smoking mountain. Frodo, all the while feeling the ring dragging on him with greater and greater weight as it nears its place of origin. Their destination is Mount Doom, but as they wearily ascend the road up the mountain, they are assaulted by Gollum, who has followed them in the final throes of his own desperation, frantic to recover the ring for himself. Sam finds that despite the creature's countless vile treacheries, he cannot bring himself to kill him in cold blood. With a curse of disgust, he orders Gollum to leave, turning to follow Frodo. Once he's out of sight, however, Gollum, still following the lure of the ring, follows on.
Gollum's complex relationship with Frodo is driven by many conflicting factors. There's his desire for the ring and his hatred of its possessor on the one hand, and on the other, there's his reaction to the mercy and kindnesses shown him by Frodo. So the battle that these contradictory impulses wage within his psyche become a kind of medieval morality play. But unlike a morality play, his malice wins out over the brief flickerings of respect and loyalty to Frodo.
I think by the time of Gollum betraying Frodo and Sam to Shelob, with that act of betrayal, there is no further hope, as it were, for Gollum. He's become morally irredeemable.
Gollum is easily Tolkien's most complex character. Gollum's will and desire are focused almost exclusively on the ring that he possessed for so long and lost. His desire to possess it again is matched only by his hatred for the thief Baggins, who took it from him. Frodo's situation mirrors Gollum's very precisely. Taking the ring first unwillingly, the Hobbit resists its lure time and time again, though his struggle not to yield costs him terribly. His awareness of Gollum's unreliability and his distaste of the creature's fawning flattery leave him desperate to be quit of his unwelcome travelling companion. But every time Gollum's life lies in his hands, he chooses mercy over instinct, sparing Gollum's life both on principle and out of a growing fellow feeling for the misery he suffers, deprived of his precious. The mercy and empathy he displays for Gollum serve him better than any practical assessment of what to do with Gollum. In Tolkien's tale, the single-minded assertion of will is almost always fatal, while the practice of sympathy, empathy and mercy bring salvation where no amount of reason could have anticipated it.
Tolkien was on a number of occasions gently critical of Shakespeare. He felt, for example, that Shakespeare could have done more with the Forest of Dunsinane and Macbeth, and he addressed this in his own way with the creation of the Ents. Tolkien was also critical of Shakespeare's handling of the elves, for example in Midsummer Night's Dream, but I'm certain that he recognised the majesty and power of Shakespeare, and any work that deals with themes such as mercy and forgiveness inevitably invites comparison with famous speeches like The Quality of Mercy that we find in The Merchant of Venice. And personally, I think there are some interesting parallels to be drawn between Gollum and Shylock, and I don't think it's going too far to suggest that there might be at least a subliminal influence at work there.
It ends up with two against overwhelming odds. You know, it's Frodo and Sam on Mount Doom. This is where it leaves that whole epic tradition way behind, because that little epic tradition doesn't have any room for your little foot soldier to be, you know, the absolute linchpin of the whole thing.
Sam finds Frodo in the Chamber of Fire before the cracks of doom, where he announces he will not cast the ring into the fire, claiming it for himself.
It's an extraordinary development in which, you know, at the very last moment, Frodo claims the ring as his own and betrays the quest, actually. And I think there's a feeling that if Frodo could do this, anybody's capable of it, which may have been, you know, what Tolkien was trying to get across to the reader. You too, dear reader, are not proof against this kind of corruption.
What Frodo does is, you know, desertion in the face of the enemy, almost. It's, you know, it is at the very last minute, you know. He fails. His courage gives out. He, you know, and he can't resist anymore.
As he places it on his finger and vanishes, Gollum rushes past Sam to seize the invisible Frodo and wrestle with him on the brink of a fiery pit.
Tolkien often depicts the ring, sometimes as though it were still serving Sauron's will, trying to obey his bidding, or sometimes as an agency in its own right, trying to influence its own fate and the fates of those who are involved in it in different ways.
It's the greatest power on Middle-earth when united with Sauron, but even it has limits.
Gollum lifts something to his mouth and bites it, leaving a suddenly visible Frodo in a heap on the floor as he dances with glee, holding up the ring with Frodo's severed finger still thrust through it. In his rapture, however, he missteps, and with a great cry, plunges into the fire, taking the ring with him.
In a sense, it all comes down to that one piece of pure contingency. He might not have stepped that way, he might have stepped a different way, and then the whole outcome would have been different. And I think this is a theme in Tolkien, that tiny things make very, very big differences, and uses us to question, is that just chance? It's as if Tolkien's saying to us, don't overestimate your importance in the scheme of things.
Every character who tries to impose his or her will on events by direct exertion of power never achieves their ends, and usually comes to a tragic or a sad end, sometimes with redeeming events along the way, but they suffer tremendously. And those characters who find power not in some external instrument or object, but in themselves, through their love, either for Middle-earth itself or for other characters, they find themselves triumphing against all odds.
At once, Mount Doom erupts, and rivers of lava begin to flow down its sides. Sam urges the delirious Frodo on, but the hobbits are soon cut off by the streams of molten rock, and they lie together, fully expecting to meet their deaths. The story then returns to the battle before the gates of Mordor, in which the forces of Gondor are facing total defeat. With the cataclysmic events following the destruction of the ring, the armies of Mordor seem to waver. The ring-wraiths on their flying steeds scream towards Mount Doom, aware at once of the threat to their master's power. But they are too late. The ring is destroyed. The Black Tower crumbles in ruin. The ring-wraiths and Sauron perish from Middle-earth.
This is Tolkien saying that, you know, the greatest power in Middle-earth is still not omnipotent. In fact, has this fantastic blind spot, which takes the form of not being able, actually takes the form of lack of imagination. A staggering inability to imagine that anybody would do anything with the ring that he, Sauron, wouldn't do. You know, that's what Sauron can't imagine until it's too late. And of course, the last thing he would do, the very last thing, is to destroy the ring. He would use it.
Frodo's character is tested by his experiences in The Return of the King more deeply than that of any other figure in the story. Along with Sam, he must push himself beyond the limits of physical endurance to reach Mount Doom. It is absolutely central to Tolkien's scheme that at the end, having reached his objective against seemingly impossible odds, Frodo fails, refusing to destroy the ring and claiming it at last for his own. He is saved by Gollum's frantic intervention to save his precious for himself. But he spends the rest of his days in Middle-earth, afflicted by a complex regret, both for his loss of the ring and for his failure to destroy it himself. This aspect of the story inspired a great deal of debate and still does today.
Well, I think that he found certain aspects of the success, particularly the cult aspects and the extreme amount of publicity, very difficult, particularly as he was getting older by this time. He was frightened of the intrusions on his privacy.
He didn't like fame, and he didn't like all the palaver at all. He never actually really ever appreciated that he'd become famous, always wealthy. He always worried about his finances and that he hadn't got much money and he was overspending.
He was disturbed by the fact that quite clearly a lot of people who read his books and loved them were a bit nutty. I mean, this is the unfortunate fact that The Lord of the Rings does tend to appeal particularly to solitary, lonely people, a little like Tolkien himself.
In his own correspondence, Tolkien reports receiving a number of letters from readers who were outraged at what they saw as Frodo's betrayal of the trust placed in him by Gandalf, Elrond and Aragorn. These writers couldn't accept that Frodo should be received like a hero afterwards. In the face of these objections, Tolkien's response was to point out that Frodo's moral responsibility demanded that he should attempt to carry out the quest to the utmost limits of his physical and spiritual power, which in Tolkien's view he did so. And Tolkien felt that the ring's destruction by Gollum, rather than by Frodo, should be seen as an instance of the mysterious workings of fate and grace that had governed the affairs of Middle-earth from its very earliest history.
We need to bear in mind that this is the Frodo who, at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, says to Gandalf, "What a pity Bilbo didn't stab Gollum in the dark when he first gained the ring." And here is Frodo at the end, who has far more reason for wishing to kill Gollum than Bilbo ever did, choosing not to, showing mercy. And even Sam gets in the act on the end, on the very slopes of Mount Doom, where the defeated Gollum is groveling in the dust at his feet, and he could very easily dispatch him if he wants to. Even he can't bring himself to kill him. And those acts of mercy and generosity are every bit as important in the moral economy of the story as any element of heroic perseverance to an end.
In the end, it is the mercy of Bilbo, Frodo and Sam, all of whom had the chance to kill Gollum and did not, that rules the fate of the ring and of all Middle-earth. The result of all this for Frodo is that he emerges with his character more enlarged than that of any other figure in the book. His experience runs the fullest gamut, from ignorant hobbit parochialism to the very centre of world-shattering events, from humble goodwill to proud willfulness to chastened wisdom.
As Sandman says, "Oh, you have become very wise." And he has. Much good that it does him. Because he's become wise, but the cost, has been that he's virtually broken.
After the festivities surrounding the crowning of the king, the army returns to Minas Tirith, where the surviving members of the Fellowship of the Ring are reunited. Following the wedding of Aragorn and Arwen, the hobbits at last begin the journey northward in the large party that includes the new king and queen, the riders of Rohan, Gandalf, Galadriel and Celeborn, and Legolas and Gimli. Their first destination is Edoras, the chief city of Rohan, where they lay to rest the body of Theoden and celebrate the marriage of Eowyn and Faramir, who had fallen in love while in the care of the healers in Minas Tirith. From there they continue on to Isengard to visit Treebeard and his Ents, who have been keeping watch on Saruman in his tower. Treebeard admits that even he came to have pity on Saruman's ruin, and he could not bear to see any living thing held long in captivity. So he let Saruman go. Aragorn and Arwen now return to their city, while Gimli and Legolas turn eastward to visit Legolas's homeland in Mirkwood. The hobbits, elves and Gandalf continue northward through the Gap of Rohan into the deserted lands of Enoway. On their road north, they overtake the fallen wizard, travelling like a ragged beggar in the company of Wormtongue. Saruman sneers at them all, pointing out spitefully that they may not enjoy their victory so much after all. Once they reach the Redhorn Gate, Galadriel and Celeborn bid them farewell, travelling back to Lothlorien. The hobbits continue northwards with Gandalf until they reach Bree, where Gandalf parts with them for, as he puts it, a long conversation with Tom Bombadil in the Old Forest. The hobbits, now on their own, return from Bree to the Shire. A lesser writer might have ended the tale there, but Tolkien rolls the story forward with a marvellous epilogue to the great events.
Tolkien had the problem of, well, what happens next? What happens now? So the marriage of Aragorn and Arwen, that's fine. Then there's this really curious bit which sometimes appears a bit arbitrary, which is the scouring of the Shire. Because in a way, the scouring of the Shire is a major digression that really isn't essential to the plot or even to the story. But I think Tolkien had some things he wanted to get off his chest in the scouring of the Shire that wouldn't fit anywhere else. So yeah, it's a bit of an anomaly in terms of its structure compared to the neat pattern of the other books.
You can't help feeling that with this long denouement, Tolkien is now enjoying his own tale so much that he simply can't bear to finish it. It's almost as if he too is waiting to see what happens next. It's as if he just wants to keep going on with this wonderful creation and he doesn't want to leave Middle-earth. And that's certainly a feeling that's been shared by millions of readers.
The hobbits discover that Saruman had hired gangs of outlaw men to create a ruinous little police state in the Shire, stealing the land's produce, throwing up senseless, ugly buildings, chopping down trees, and imprisoning any hobbits who objected.
By the end of it, he is the exploiter. He is the man of the machines. He is the man of the machine age of tearing things up, hacking down the trees, disemboweling the earth, building the whole, the ultimate machine civilization, which Tolkien didn't like at all.
With Merry and Pippin as captains, Frodo organizes a resistance movement that quickly ejects the oppressors. Confronting Saruman at Bag End, Frodo gives him leave to go where he will, even though most of the hobbits wish to kill him. Saruman prepares to go, directing his abuse at Wormtongue, who suddenly rebels and kills Saruman on the spot before being himself shot by hobbit archers.
Saruman has a role in the Return of the King. It's a grievously reduced role from his former position of power, but he still has enough power to do, as I think Gandalf says, malice in a small way. Towards the end of his life, Tolkien was asked by somebody whether he thought Sauron had won in this world, as it were, was in charge. And he said no, he didn't think that was the case, but he did think that Saruman was doing very well. And I think he associated Saruman with politics in its unflattering sense, and bureaucracy and petty-mindedness and those kinds of vices. And that's what Saruman became reduced to in the end.
The rest of the story concerns Frodo's last few years in the Shire, where he leads a comfortable existence, but is deeply troubled by the memories of the ring, the loss of which has scarred him in spirit.
At last, offered the opportunity by Galadriel, he joins Gandalf and the elves as they meet at the Blue Havens to sail out of Middle-earth altogether, to the undying lands of the Valar, where Frodo can find healing for his inner wounds.
It's only in the lands of the Valar, across the oceans in the Undying Land, that Frodo can go to find final healing, which is why Galadriel offers him a place on the boat and he takes it.
I think it's fair enough to consider, where the ring bearers went across the sea as a kind of heaven. There may be more than one kind of heaven, and certainly the idea of heaven is something that we understand, and that was Tolkien's idea of heaven, was peace. Probably peace and quiet, actually. And he associated those virtues with healing.
It is in The Return of the King that Tolkien's primary themes of good and evil, power, will and desire find their fullest expression. Though he is often accused of simplistic moralizing by his critics, Tolkien in fact crafts a number of brief but finely shaded character studies that probe with great subtlety the complex interrelationships between the individual will and the power to do good or evil. The complex narrative structure of The Return of the King reflects the complex narrative structure of the entire work, as its multiple strands all find their resolutions in the story's climax and lengthy denouement. Yet the overarching complexity rests on a foundation of simple human values and virtues: love, loyalty, fortitude and mercy.
The Return of the King ends up back in the Shire, where the whole thing started. I think that's consistent with Tolkien's emphasis on, that daily life of ordinary people is ultimately what matters most. Ultimately, that's the important arena for what happens in this world. Oddly enough, perhaps.
To have such an enormous story turn on the dedication and devotion of two small hobbits as they crawl through the choking ash of Mordor's militarized, industrialized wasteland is to suggest that the mysteries of will, choice and love conceal powers far greater than those wielded by politicians, generals, captains of industry, and even cosmic princes of darkness such as Sauron.
There's various hints in the book that fate, or whatever you want to call it, might be working on the side of those trying to destroy the ring. But fate doesn't have a chance to help you unless you're willing to help yourself. And this is one of the moral lessons that Tolkien keeps returning to again and again. One character remarks, Saruman may be very clever, but I don't think he'd have any pluck in a tight corner like Gandalf would. And that's very important. So even down to the level of the hobbit saying, well, I'm only a hobbit, I can't do much, but I've got this sword, and if I'm going to die, I'll go down fighting. That's a very important attitude to have, Tolkien felt, because right up to the last minute, it gives fate or God or whatever you want to call it a chance to change things.
Having grown up a member of the generation that suffered the traumas of horror and loss during the First World War, only to see them reenacted on an even larger and more senseless scale during the Second, Tolkien sought, perhaps instinctively, to champion a vision of beauty and hope grounded not in the powers of governments and their leaders, but in the unseen and unpredictable powers of the human condition.